Sarai never intended to change the world. She only sought a bit more time, a few dollars for herself and a glass of lemonade to quench her thirst. But fate had its plans, turning her simple acts into something far greater. On a blistering afternoon, with the scent of citrus mingling with the promise of something new, the world took notice in a way she never could have imagined. 12-year-old Sarai Rivera had a smile that could light up a room, but lately it wasn't as bright as it used to be. Fighting leukemia had worn her down. Months of chemo, endless hospital stays that felt like a trap, and the heavy silence of uncertainty in every conversation. Big Shaq was making an impact once again, this time in a corner of the world he never expected. He had seen a young boy effortlessly sinking hoops on a downtown court. The kid's raw talent was undeniable, and with the right guidance, he could go far. Without hesitation, Big Shaq offered to mentor him, promising to help turn his dream of playing in the big leagues into reality. Unbeknownst to anyone, the young boy would soon become the link between Sarai and Big Shaq. Before Sarai got sick, Sarai was full of energy and laughter, always moving, always free. She'd dance barefoot outside until the streetlights came on, spin through the tiny hallways of their East London flat, and fall asleep with stories still swirling in her mind. She dreamed big of dancing under bright stage lights, of writing stories that made people feel the way books made her feel seen, understood, and limitless. Then something changed. At first, it was barely noticeable. One morning, her legs felt heavy, and the run to school that used to be easy became a slow, tiring climb up the stairs. Her teacher saw how she slouched at her desk, resting her chin in her hand, her once bright eyes looking tired and distant. Then came the small bruises, but they stuck around too long, darkening and spreading. A tiny scrape that wouldn't heal, a bump that stayed purple for weeks. And then, one day, nothing was the same anymore. Sarai sat on the living room floor with her legs crossed, reading to her mom. As she spoke, Angela absent-mindedly ran her fingers through Sarai's thick, dark curls, just like she always did. But this time, when she pulled her hand away, too many strands were tangled in her fingers. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Angela just stared at the hair in her hand, her breath shaky, as if the very strands held a secret she wasn't ready to face. Sarai looked up, a question on her lips, but stopped when she saw the fear etched in her mother's eyes. Her lips trembled, as though she was silently begging for something, anything other than what was unfolding before them. Without a word, Sarai reached up, her fingers trembling as she grabbed a handful of her own hair. She tugged gently, testing the strength of it. The strands slipped out too easily, too quickly. The book in her lap fell with a thud to the floor. Her mother's voice broke the silence, urging her to get changed. But as Sarai headed upstairs, she overheard her mother speaking urgently into the phone, telling her father they were going to the hospital. Something was wrong, and he needed to meet them there. And so the journey began. The doctor's words echoed in her mind, but all Sarai could remember was the heartbreaking sound of her mother crying. Leukemia, cancer, treatment, survival rates. The words floated around the small, white room, light as air but heavy with meaning. They didn't feel real. They were words from TV shows, hushed conversations about distant relatives. Pamphlets no one ever wanted to read, not words that belonged to her. Her mom's hand gripped hers, trembling and tight, as if it might shatter at any moment. Angela's breath came in uneven gasps, as though she was holding on by a thread, desperately trying to keep herself together. Sarai wanted to tell her it was okay, that she wasn't scared, but the truth was, she didn't even know what to be afraid of. Not yet. The doctor's voice continued steady and calm, like he was trying to make sense of words that felt too heavy, too foreign. Acute lymphoblastic leukemia, aggressive but treatable. Chemotherapy, bone marrow tests, side effects, hair loss, fatigue. Sarai sat on the exam table, her legs swinging, the dull thud of her feet against the metal, the only sound in the room. The doctor's words were just noise, big words, but they didn't fit together in her mind. Everything felt distant. The room seemed to shrink around her, the walls closing in, suffocating her. She glanced at her dad. David sat frozen in his chair, his gaze fixed on the floor as if trying to memorize the cracks in the tile. His hands were clenched, his arms tense. He had always been the rock, the strong one. But now, for the first time, she saw the cracks in him too. And then the doctor said the word, treatment, and suddenly everything felt real. Sarai's stomach dropped. How long? Her mom's voice was barely a whisper, strained with fear. The doctor hesitated, flipping through his notes, picking his words carefully as though they were fragile. He said that with early and strong treatment, most kids do well. But it wouldn't be easy. The next year would be a battle. A year. Her mom's sob broke the silence, soft but heart-wrenching. Sarai gripped the fabric of her dress, not sure if she was holding on to comfort herself or bracing for what was coming next. The doctor's voice continued, but it was just a distant hum now. Sarai realized in that moment that her life would never be the same again. At first, she tried to keep up with school, pushing through the tiredness and pretending everything was normal. But then she started losing weight. The hospital visits got longer. The questions from classmates got harder. Some kids whispered when they thought she couldn't hear. They said she looked weird without hair. They asked why she was always sick and if they could catch it. Others didn't bother whispering, and they said maybe she was just faking it for attention. It hurt. Worse than the needles, worse than the sickness. They didn't see the long nights, the endless hospital stays, the way her parents barely slept, the quiet prayers she whispered into her pillow. But the most challenging moment, the night she heard her mom crying. "Why, God?" Angela sobbed into her hands, not knowing Sarai was awake. "Why her? Why my baby?" Sarai turned to the wall, letting silent tears soak her pillow. She hadn't cried when the doctor said cancer, not when her hair fell out in clumps. But hearing her mom break like that was what shattered her. Leukemia was always there, sitting heavy in their home like an unwelcome guest. The bills piled up. The chemo drained Sarai's strength, and yet, wrapped in a soft lavender scarf, she still laughed like nothing could touch her. But Sarai wasn't clueless. She saw the weight her parents carried, and she refused just to sit and wait for another hospital bill to decide her future. If she could help, even a little, she would. And that's how Lemonade for Life began. The sun burned high in the sky, making the streets of East London feel like an oven. The air wavered over the pavement, thick with heat, carrying the sweet scent of lemons and sugar from a little wooden stand at the end of the street. A bright yellow sign, painted with uneven letters, read, "Sarai's Lemonade, helping hands, healing hearts." Sarai stood behind the stand, gripping a glass pitcher, her fingers sticky with lemon pulp. At 12 years old, she was small but unstoppable, eyes dark like the night sky, a voice soft but sure, a spirit that refused to break. This wasn't just some summer lemonade stand. It was her fight, her way of pushing back against the fear, the hospital bills, and the future that felt like it was slipping away. She sold each glass for $1, pouring more than just lemonade, pouring hope, determination, a silent plea for someone to notice. And then someone did. Sarai's parents, Angela and David, were by her every day, their love like a shield around her. Angela, always the caretaker, ensured Sarai took breaks, gently pressing cool clothes to her forehead when the heat got too much. David, quiet but steady, worked extra hours at the mechanic shop, but still found time to make new signs for the stand, sanding the wood smooth with tired hands. Their community showed up in ways big and small. Mrs. Patel from next door brought fresh lemons from her garden, squeezing Sarai's hands, and whispered they were all with her. Mr. Johnson, the retired carpenter, built extra stands as more and more people came by. Even the local doctor, Dr. Adebayo, stopped after his shifts to check on Sarai, ensuring she wasn't overworking herself. The neighborhood kids pitched in, running around with flyers and drawing chalk arrows on the pavement to point people toward the stand. And then someone unexpectedly noticed. Shaquille O'Neal, Big Shaq to the world, wasn't just a basketball legend. He was more than a champion, more than the guy who had shattered backboards and changed the game. He was larger than life in every way, but what stood out the most wasn't his height or his trophies, it was his heart. Even after retiring from basketball, Shaquille O'Neal didn't just sit back and enjoy his success, He used it to help others. He built more than a fortune. He built a life around giving. There were stories, ones rarely shared but always felt. The time he paid off a struggling mom's layaway bill at a store. The time he tipped a waiter enough to cover their rent. The time he overheard someone worrying about their broken-down car and bought them a new one on the spot. For Big Shaq, generosity wasn't a big event, and it was just who he was. So when he heard about Sarai, a little girl fighting the toughest battle of her life, selling lemonade to help her family, something in him shifted. He knew that fight. He recognized that kind of heart. And when Shaquille O'Neal moved, the world noticed. The black SUV rolled up to the curb, its windows dark and sleek, the engine barely making a sound. The crowd, already buzzing around the lemonade stand, went still. Then the door opened, and there he was, Shaq, Big Shaq, the diesel, 7 feet of pure presence stepping out into the golden afternoon light, a crisp white t-shirt stretched over broad shoulders, dark jeans falling perfectly over designer sneakers, a gold watch glinting at his wrist. For a moment, everything stopped. People went quiet. A kid on his bike wobbled, almost falling over. Hands fumbled for phones, rushing to capture the moment. Even the air felt different, buzzing with excitement. Then Shaq looked at the little lemonade stand, and he smiled. Shaq looked at the girl behind it. She had a lavender scarf wrapped around her head, and though her hands trembled slightly, her dark eyes were steady. A hint of a smile crossed his face as he tilted his head and asked if she was the boss here. His deep voice was warm, playful, like he knew the answer, but wanted to hear her say it. Sarai took a deep breath and stood a little taller, trying to ignore the way her heart pounded. She swallowed the lump in her throat and lifted her chin. Despite the exhaustion weighing on her, she spoke with quiet confidence, letting him know that she was the one in charge. A big, genuine grin spread across his face, filled with admiration. He gave a small nod, letting out one simple word: respect. She did her best to keep her hands steady as she poured a glass of lemonade and passed it to him. He took it smoothly, lifting it to his lips while everyone around them seemed to hold their breath, watching. A few seconds ticked by, just long enough to make everyone lean in a little closer. Then, with a deep, dramatic sigh, he nodded, his face serious like a top food critic about to give his final review. He declared it absolutely ping. Laughter spread through the crowd, the tension vanishing in an instant. Sarai felt a smile creep onto her face, even though she was tired down to her bones. In that moment, standing in the heat with everyone watching and the future still unknown, she felt something she hadn't in a long time: proud. The crowd's laughter spread like a warm breeze, easing the tension in the air. Sarai let out a small giggle, a spark of pride lighting up inside her. But just as quickly as the moment came, it changed. Shaq set the cup down gently, his face turning serious. He crouched down to her level, his eyes steady as he told her he had heard about her, about the battle she was fighting. His voice was calm but carried a weight that hung in the air between them. Sarai's smile faded slightly. She had never wanted pity, never wanted people to look at her like she was fragile. But as she held his gaze, she realized there was none of that. Instead, she saw something else: deep understanding and respect. She said she was doing her best, that chemo was expensive, and the weight of it sat heavily on her, and even more on her parents every single day. Big Shaq listened, his jaw tightening like he had words he wanted to say, but held back. Then without a word, he reached into his pocket, pulled out a folded check, and placed it on the counter. It was a simple movement, as easy as dropping spare change, but the meaning behind it was anything but small. Wondering what it was, she opened it. For a moment, Sarai just stared, her brain struggling to make sense of the numbers before her. Everything felt unreal, like a dream she hadn't caught up to yet. Behind her, she heard her mother gasp, the sound sharp and full of disbelief. Her hand flew to her mouth as if trying to hold in the shock. $50,000. Big Shaq's voice was calm, almost gentle, as he told her this was just the start. Everything around her felt like it was spinning. Her breath caught in her throat, and she gripped the edge of the stand, needing something solid to hold on to. Barely above a whisper, she asked him if it was real. Without a moment of doubt, he tapped the check with his finger, his gaze steady. This wasn't a handout, he told her. It was an investment in her. The words wrapped around her like a quiet promise, a reminder that she was more than just her illness, more than the struggle weighing her down. And in that moment, hope stirred inside her, something she hadn't felt in a long time. Her eyes stung, her mind frozen, her body unable to move. And then, all at once, the weight inside her cracked open. She threw herself forward, wrapping her arms around him in a hug that held nothing back. He embraced her gently, his hand resting steadily on her back, offering warmth without words. The crowd erupted, clapping, cheering, cameras flashing, but none of it mattered. At that moment, it was just Sarai and Big Shaq. And then, as the internet always does, the moment spreads like wildfire. Within minutes, the video was everywhere. The effect was instant. The story spread like wildfire. Big Shaq's big heart trended everywhere, and the video of his visit racked up millions of views overnight. Donations flooded in from all over the world, strangers giving what they could for a little girl they had never met but now felt connected to. But Big Shaq wasn't finished. By morning, the fundraiser had soared to $250,000, more than enough to cover Sarai's treatments, clear her parents' debts, and even help other kids fighting the same battle. Tears ran down Sarai's face as she stared at the final number, overwhelmed by it all. Without thinking, she threw her arms around Big Shaq, barely reaching around his waist. Her voice shook as she told him she had no idea how to thank him, the weight of everything catching in her throat. He chuckled, deep and warm, his own eyes shining as he brushed away a stray tear. Then he told her he only wanted one thing in return. She just had to get better. That would be thanks enough. Days later, he came back again, but this time he wasn't alone. Behind him stood a team of volunteers, crates of fresh lemons, bags of sugar, and a brand new banner that read, "Sarai's Stand sponsored by Big Shaq Foundation." The whole neighborhood came together. What started as a simple lemonade stand turned into something bigger, a movement. Pop-up stalls appeared all over America. Celebrities joined in, pouring lemonade for charity. Schools made it part of their lessons, teaching kids about kindness, resilience, and how one small idea could change lives. Within a month, the Lemonade Foundation was created, giving financial help to kids fighting serious illnesses. And at the center of it all was Sarai, the girl who had once stood alone in the summer heat, selling lemonade to save her own life. Years later, she stood on a TED stage, her hair grown back in tight curls, her eyes bright with hope for the future. Taking a deep breath, she prepared to tell the world her story. Her voice was clear and strong as she spoke, filled with the kind of certainty that only comes from lived experience. She told the audience that when life gives you lemons, making lemonade isn't enough. Instead, she said, you take those lemons, face the challenge head on, and turn it into something bigger than you ever imagined. In the front row, Big Shaq sat with his hands clasped, a proud grin spreading across his face. And Sarai understood something deeply as the morning sun warmed the city, chasing away the last of the winter chill. Miracles don't always come with grand announcements. Sometimes they begin with a simple cup of lemonade and someone willing to stop and listen. Given the chance to do anything, knowing it would cause a ripple effect that can affect many lives, what would you do? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.